Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
When you hear the word landlord, what do you think?
Ugh.
I think cheap. Cheap comes to mind.
Evil, entitled, no compassion.
I had this one landlord in Toronto. I was living in a one-bedroom apartment, and after a couple years, I told him that my partner was moving in. He responded by asking me to pay more rent. He cited a number that was well beyond the legal allowance to raise rent, and I think he knew that because he asked me to pay the difference monthly in cash, in an envelope to be left in the mailbox that he would pick up.
What else? Greedy, careless, flaky.
Terrible. When I hear the word landlord, I think of that jerk in Edmonton. My toilet broke, and I called him for 3 days before he called me back. And when he did, it was just to tell me that I needed to call a plumber and pay for it, even though it wasn't my fault.
Anyway, that's what I think about landlords.
With an ever-growing and increasingly insurmountable gap between the wealthy and the rest of us, it's no wonder that landlords don't have a great reputation these days. But have you ever thought of becoming one yourself in this economy? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings, and you are listening to In This Economy, where we help you understand the systems that create your money problems, from grocery bills to mortgage payments to the impossibility of owning a house and everything in between. According to data collected by the Canadian Real Estate Association, the current average cost of a house in Canada right now is just over $700,000. If you're living in Toronto or Vancouver, you're probably thinking, that sounds really cheap. Yes, that's right. In urban centers like Toronto and Vancouver, the average rises to well over $1 million. And the cost of renting remains at an all-time high as well and keeps on climbing. So obviously, the cost of housing is one of the biggest stressors in this economy, and one of our favorite things to do on this show is take a look at what people are doing to make owning a house possible for them. One of our earlier episodes was about co-ownership, that is, buying a house with a friend or even a stranger. Today, we're looking at a slightly more traditional idea: buying a house that has a basement unit or something that you can rent out to help cover your mortgage. In other words, yes, crossing over to the dark side and becoming a landlord. Nelda Schulte has been investing in property in various ways for 18 years. She also runs a property management company. She is a veteran landlord. You could even say she's written or at least a book on being a landlord in Canada because she's the author of the Canadian Landlords Handbook, Landlord Fundamentals 101. And the first thing I had to do when we sat down was to get the landlord's bad rap out of the way. The first thing I will ask you is a show like this called In This Economy, where many people who write to us are struggling. For a lot of our listeners, landlord is kind of a four-letter word these days. How do you think that happened?
Yeah, and unfortunately it is. There's this misconception that landlords are these really rich, evil people who like to gouge people whatever they can, and they've got tons of money, they just don't want to spend it. But the reality of the situation is that most landlords that I know are people like me. You know, we have full-time jobs. People have families. They are trying to figure out how they can make their investments work for them so that they're not poor when they grow older. And, you know, if you just put your money in the bank, that's not going to do it for you. And a lot of people have been told that real estate is a good place to invest, and so that's what they do. I certainly went to a lot of different real estate investment forums and a lot of investment forums before I had any money at all, just because I wanted to figure out what I could do. Because if I was just trying to save a little pittance from my salary every month, I thought, boy, that's not really going to get me very far.
I mean, a lot of people have talked to me about, and this is why we're talking to you, quite frankly, about becoming a landlord for, say, a basement rental property being perhaps one of the only options they would have to be able to afford a home.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's true. And that's actually how I started. And that was the investment advice that I was given when I thought, how am I ever going to be able to afford a house on my own? Because I wasn't married. I've actually been single most of my life, been married briefly for 10 years. And I thought, how could I afford a property on my own? What happens if I get laid off? Because that's the reality of working in Canada these days. And the best solution that I could come up with was by buying a house with a rental suite or converting the downstairs into a rental suite and being able to charge rent. And then that rent could pay my mortgage regardless of whether or not I got laid off, and or it could contribute to my mortgage and help pay my mortgage down. So that's why I got into it. That's how I got into it.
So tell me about that experience then, maybe how it began and what it was like trying to actually execute it. Because again, I think a lot of people are curious about this first step in particular.
Yeah. So firstly, I looked for a property that I was living in Fort McMurray at the time, making the most money I'd ever made, which was a whopping $75,000 a year. I know that's not a lot in this day and age, but for me, that was, I thought, wow, I'm rich.
Well, I think it's good enough for a lot of people these days.
So I thought, great, I would qualify for a mortgage. So I looked around for houses that had a basement suite or had the capability for me to build a basement suite. There were even some townhouses that I looked at. And then of course, I had to find something that was in my price range. And I'd saved $40,000 as a down payment over many years. So I had the down payment, which I thought was a lot of money. And then I went to see mortgage brokers and asked them, okay, what kind of a mortgage could I get with my job that pays me this amount of money per year and with my savings? And most of them were like, well, don't you have any more money? It was really deflating. Anyway, the long and the short of it was I found a house that was in an older part of town, close to where I worked. And it had a basement suite, but it really wasn't very nice. The whole house needed upgrading and updating and painting. And I knew that I'd have to do a lot of work in the basement suite to make it into something that I was proud to show and that would rent easily. So I bought the property. And then I sort of maxed out my credit and got the downstairs suite done, which was really difficult to do because at the time, Fort McMurray was on fire, but not on fire as in on fire. But there were so many jobs, not enough people to do them, and that included the trades. So trying to get hold of anyone in the trades who could do carpentry, plumbing, electrical was just almost impossible. So I was way behind schedule. It cost way more than I thought it would, but I did get it done. And then I was also doing work, painting and trying to do whatever repairs I could while I was working full time. I was also in a show at the time too. My background is music and I was in a little shop of horrors. So I had a rehearsal schedule, a full-time job that was very full-time, and I was trying to manage getting the repairs done. And then I had a godsend moment where I had a roommate who was looking for a place to live through friends that I knew at the college that I worked at. And he was also a handyman and electrician. And so I said, well, I'll tell you what, if you move into my house, I'll give you really cheap rent in one of the rooms upstairs. And in return, you can help me with some of the stuff that I need done in the house. And he turned out to be the best person ever. He was absolutely excellent. He was meticulous. He helped me with so many things. He was moral support. And I got the suite finished and I got it rented. And then I started working on fixing up the upstairs rooms too, so I could rent those as well. So it was really a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of scheduling. And added to that, it was very stressful because I hadn't really lived with roommates most of my life. Since I moved away from home, I'd mostly lived on my own. So here, all of a sudden, I'm a landlord. I have two roommates, and I have people downstairs, and I'm working full time, and I'm singing in a show, and I'm just overwhelmed with the amount of work.
What should people understand about that process, about what it's like at the beginning as you're, for the first time, kind of in charge of managing your own property, but managing someone else's expectations of it? And what do you wish you'd known before you rented out the basement for the first time? Yeah,
really, really good question. The first thing is you need to know that there are landlord and tenant laws called the Residential Tenancies Act. And each province has a Residential Tenancies Act. You need to know what those are. That's the first step in becoming a landlord. Because once you own a rental property and you're taking money in exchange for a room, for a service, you have a business. And that business falls under the RTA. So that's the first thing I wish I'd known. Second thing I wish I'd known was how many renovations and repairs and what the cost would be for the age of the house. Had I have done things differently, I probably would have gotten a new property rather than an old property, because you never really know what's going to happen when you start ripping out walls or floors or toilets or whatever.
Right.
You don't really know what's underneath of all of that. So it could end up costing you a lot more money than you had originally anticipated. And that puts a huge stress on your life. So that's the second thing that I wish that I knew. And the third thing that I wish that I knew, I didn't know anything about hiring contractors. I didn't know anything about building permits. And I got really ripped off a couple times. So that's something else you need to look into, that if you're making any changes to the footprint of your house, you need to have building permits. What do those permits look like? How much do they cost? What's the process? So those are the three things that I wish that I knew before I started.
What are the actual requirements that you have to have? And I imagine these vary by province, but what do you have to know? And what do you have to have in place before whatever part of your house you're renting out, probably the basement, is, fit for tenants? And who regulates that? And do you have to get a license before this begins, or what?
Yeah, really good question, because most people don't ever think about that. Each province and municipality have minimum housing and health standards. And that's where those regulations fall under. So, for instance, if people are staying with me in Alberta, sharing my upstairs suite, they have to have access to a kitchen. They have to have access to a sink. They have to have access to a bathroom. That has to be in the same building, not in another building. The minimum housing and health standards for your province and your municipality will outline those requirements. They'll also tell you how many people can be in a space. It's kind of funny because they'll say no more than 10 adults. I think, is it 8 adults plus 2 children per bathroom? I can't exactly remember.
Wow.
But children are under 10 are considered half a person. So you could have 8 adults and 2 children under 10 sharing a space that only has 1 bathroom, but it has to be a certain amount of square spaces, and then bedroom spaces are a certain amount of square feet, etc. And there again, they're regulated by province. So I wouldn't be able to talk specifically about what it would be for Ontario or BC or even Alberta. I have to look them up every time. But there's some kind of weird laws. I'm going to tell you about one. When we had the property management business, we had a couple who wanted to rent out their property. We didn't notice this because usually I'd go through and I'd do a deficiency list. And when the tenants moved in, they moved in during the winter time. During the summer, they wanted to open the windows and they realized there were no screens on the windows. And so I went back to the owner and said, there are no screens on the windows. Do you have them someplace in a garage or in storage someplace and we could put them on? And he said, no, we never put screens on the windows. We just use the curtains. I said, oh, okay. So we looked up the minimum housing and health standards, and they specified in Alberta and Calgary that you had to have screens on the windows during bug season. So he had to pay to have screens put on the windows because that was part of minimum housing and health.
Yeah. And do you have to make an application and have the property inspected before you can rent it out? Or can you just start renting it out and then as long as nobody complains or nobody sees anything, it's never going to reach that level?
Yes and no. Most of the time people rent out their property without knowing what the minimum housing and health standards are.
Right.
And yes, if somebody complains, then they might come in and inspect. I haven't heard of that happening very often at all. With basement suites...
That's why I asked, because it seems the whole thing can seem to get a little shady when you're talking about just renting a basement suite as opposed to like an actual apartment in an apartment building.
Yeah. And basement suites can be legal or illegal, but you can still rent out an illegal suite and have a legal lease in place. The difference between, in Calgary, for instance, a legal basement suite and an illegal basement suite is if you're wanting to get, let's say you already have a basement suite in place. Let's say you bought a place that had a full kitchen, including a stove and a fridge, but you don't have a basement permit. Then you would have to take the stove out. You have to decide whether or not you want to legalize your basement suite and spend the money doing that and get a sticker and be registered with the city. Or if you're only going to get a basement permit, in which case you have to take the stove out. You can't have a stove and an oven in there. Do people rent them out without getting them checked out and approved first? Yes, lots and lots of people do. Some of the municipalities were getting stricter, like Calgary was getting stricter. They were starting to crack down on illegal suites. But then they changed the zoning bylaws and they allowed people like me who had an illegal suite when I bought the house to grandfather illegal suite in by just doing some very simple things. It only cost me $2,500 to legalize a suite. And it was very short. It was a couple months. So will somebody report me if I have an illegal suite? They might. But do people roam around with cars and spotlights trying to find people who may or may not be fulfilling their minimum housing and health standards? No.
What about, you've mentioned so far as we talk, leases and long-term commitments. Have you examined the short-term rental business? Are you in that? What are your thoughts on, again, if you're looking for a supplementary income as a part of your house, of one versus the other?
Yeah, I have done short-term. I've done short-term and long-term. I've done Airbnb. So short-term rentals used to be pretty simple before the legislation caught up to them. So it used to be you could just advertise whatever you had on Airbnb and you could get people fairly quickly. And now you have to get a business license, which didn't cost me very much. It was about $100. And you have to post it in obvious places. And then I think now you have to get an inspection. I didn't at the time. And then you can advertise. And then you need to have the proper insurance because there are a lot of insurance companies who will not cover you if you do an Airbnb or a short-term rental because they think it's too risky. So I did them. I did short-term rentals in between long-term leases, and it worked out really well, but I still screened my tenants. I met a lot of really interesting people who were coming here for lots of interesting reasons, fencing competitions. There was a guy who wanted to get into the police force. He was doing his examinations and his training. People who were stopping over in between, traveling to different countries. People who came from different countries who had family who were living here, and I got to meet their whole family. So yeah, it was most of the people who were here were really super nice and very interesting and very appreciative. But it's becoming harder to do short-term rentals in places like Ontario and BC because of the housing shortage throughout Canada, and governments are trying to crack down on landlords, making it harder for them to do short-term rentals or making it impossible for them to do short-term rentals so that they rent to long-term tenants.
Do you think that most people who become landlords in the way we've been talking about, renting out a small piece of their house or a couple of rooms, are equipped to go on and do what you've done, which is start managing multiple properties and turn this into a real business? And what does somebody need to be prepared for to make that move from, being a single part of a property landlord to trying to maximize income?
You need a really good team of people to help you because you can't do everything on your own, and you really shouldn't do everything on your own. So my property in Fort McMurray, I've got a really fabulous handyman who actually, when I interviewed all these different guys, I interviewed my handyman and I said, so what types of handyman work can you do? And he said, I can build your house from the bottom up to the roof. He said, I could pour the concrete, I can do the foundation, I can do the carpentry, I can do everything. And he's been great. So you need a really good handyman. You need to have people like a plumber, you need an electrician. If you're doing short-term rentals, you have to have an arbitrage team, you have to have a cleaning team, and you have to train them. You need a good property manager, which is really difficult to find. So you need a good team in place. So if you're going to upscale, you have to have a team. And
Right.
they need to know how you want things done and when you want them done, and they have to be good communicators. I think that's really important. And I also think it's really important that you know the rules, you know the RTA, you know how a good property should be managed because you've done it before, so you can hand it off to somebody else. Because I think what a lot of landlords make the mistake of doing is they think, oh, well, I'll just hand it off to property manager, any given property manager, and I'll be fine. And it doesn't work that way. You can get bad property managers just like you can get bad carpenters, bad doctors, bad accountants. You have to screen people, and you need to know how to screen them.
The last thing I want to ask you is just, again, for people who are considering this path and have been listening to it, what are the risks you would warn them about, and what do they need to prepare for if they're really going to try to make this work as a way of owning a home?
Well, the first risk is you have to make sure that the property that you're buying is going to cash flow, and that if you have to pay the mortgage when you have vacancies, can you do it without it bankrupting you?
Right.
That's number one. And secondly, if it's not in the same province or city that you're in, do you have somebody who's a good property manager who you trust, who can do a really good job? Because if it's not well managed, forget it. You're not ever going to make money. So that's the first thing, is the investment. And secondly, do you have a good property manager and good team who are going to be reasonable, they're going to be fair, they're going to get things done when they need to be done. They understand that an emergency is an emergency and what to do. And then thirdly, what do you want to deal with? What do you like dealing with? Do you want to deal with this kind of stuff in your spare time, or maybe not even in your spare time, as part of your workday? Or do you just find it a pain in the neck? Because if you find it a pain in the neck, don't do it. Landlording is not for the faint of heart.
Nelda Schulte is a real estate investor and a property manager who's written a book on the basics of becoming a landlord in Canada. Thanks to her for sharing her advice and her experiences with us and reminding us that whether you love or hate yours, landlords are people too, and some of them are just trying to make it. If you have a money problem or just a question about this wild economy we're all living through, we want to hear from you. You can email us at hello@itepod.ca. You can call us and just talk it out. Leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. If you don't want to give us your real name, that is totally fine. If you want us to tackle your problem, you need to give us real numbers, both your financial numbers and the number where we can reach you to call you back. Thanks so much for listening to this show, and if you liked it and want us to keep making more of it as we go, you need to let us know, or let your friends know that it exists, or rate us, or review us, or post about us on social media, whatever you can do to get the word out, because our show relies on people like you for ideas and problems to maybe, hopefully solve. Either way, thank you for everything you do to spread the word about our little show. I'm your host and executive producer, Jordan Heath Rawlings. This episode was written and produced by Marshall Whitsett, Allison Broverman, and Stephanie Phillips. The sound design was done by Robin Edgar. Mary Jubrin is our digital editor. Diana Kay is our manager of business development. Together, we make up the Frequency Podcast Network, which is a division of Rogers. Thanks again for listening. We will talk next week on In This Economy.